My mother-in-law leaned close enough for me to smell her rose perfume and whispered, "Those medals won't help you today." Then my husband asked the judge to take my daughter away from me. It was 9:17 on a wet Monday morning in downtown Dayton, Ohio. Rain streaked the tall courthouse windows, and everyone's shoes squeaked against the tile outside Courtroom 4B. I remember that detail because it was such an ordinary sound for the worst morning of my life. Daniel sat beside his attorney in a navy suit I had bought him for our 15th anniversary. He looked tired in a careful, practiced way. His tie was loosened, his eyes were red. Anybody who didn't know him might have thought he had spent the night crying. His mother, Darlene, sat directly behind him in a cream jacket and pearls, smiling like she had already picked out my grave marker. I was wearing my army dress uniform because I had come straight from a reserve command review at Wright-Patterson. I had considered changing, but my attorney Caroline Reyes told me not to. "You're not hiding who you are," she said. "Not for them." Daniel's lawyer stood and told Judge Helen Mercer that I was emotionally unstable, financially reckless, and unsafe around our 13-year-old daughter, Emily. Then Daniel took the stand. He kept his voice low and steady. "Combat changed her," he said. "She isn't the woman she used to be." For half a second I almost believed him. That was the part I hated most. I had changed. I slept lightly. I checked the locks twice. Loud bangs still sent a cold jolt through my chest before my brain caught up. Some nights I sat in the garage with the engine off because I didn't want Emily to hear me crying. But changed wasn't the same as dangerous. Daniel said I had frightened Emily while holding a loaded handgun in our kitchen. His lawyer placed a photograph on the screen. My service pistol sat on the granite counter beside a half-empty coffee mug. I stared at it. That gun had been locked in my travel case before I left for annual training. Caroline touched my wrist under the table. "Don't react," she whispered. Daniel looked at the judge. "I'm asking for emergency custody, exclusive use of the house, and temporary control of Rebecca's financial accounts until the court can determine whether she's competent." There it was. Not just my daughter. Not just the house. The money. $3.2 million from a federal civil settlement tied to the convoy explosion that damaged my hearing, tore up my shoulder, and ended the Army career I had expected to finish on my own terms. Darlene gave a soft laugh behind him. "Those medals won't help you today," she murmured. Judge Mercer heard her. Her eyes lifted, but she said nothing. After nearly 2 hours, the ruling came down. I had to leave my own home for 10 days while the allegations were investigated. My visits with Emily would be supervised. Outside the courtroom, Darlene adjusted her purse and said, "Look on the bright side, Rebecca. Hotel breakfasts are free." I watched Daniel lead Emily toward the elevator without letting her look back. Then my phone buzzed. It was an email from the bank. Someone had tried to borrow $640,000 against my house, using documents with my signature. A signature I had never written. The Residence Inn outside Wright-Patterson Air Force Base wasn't a bad place to stay. It just wasn't home. Every morning I woke up to the hum of the air conditioner, made coffee with a machine that never quite got it hot enough, and stared out the window at the same parking lot full of rental cars and pickup trucks. I had lived in barracks overseas that felt warmer than that room. My entire life fit inside one suitcase. 2 uniforms. 3 pairs of jeans. A week's worth of medication. And the framed picture of Emily holding up a blue ribbon from her 5th grade science fair. I kept that picture on the nightstand because I couldn't bear to pack it away. Caroline met me at a small diner on Colonel Glenn Highway the morning after the hearing. We'd picked that place because neither of us wanted to be recognized. She slid a yellow legal pad across the table. "Daniel isn't just trying to divorce you," she said. "I figured that much." She shook her head. "No, divorce is only part of it." I frowned. "He's trying to convince the court you're legally incapable of managing your own affairs." The waitress poured coffee before either of us spoke again. "If he succeeds," Caroline continued, "he won't just ask for custody. He'll ask the court to let him manage the settlement money." I stared at my mug. So this was always about the money. And the house. She tapped the legal pad. "If he convinces the judge you're mentally incompetent, everything else becomes easier." I suddenly remembered all the paperwork Daniel had insisted I sign over the past year. Insurance forms, tax documents, bank updates. He always brought them over while I was cooking dinner or trying to help Emily with homework. I'd signed most of them without thinking. Now I wondered how many I'd actually read. Caroline interrupted my thoughts. "We're scheduling an independent psychological evaluation." My stomach tightened. "I've already been evaluated through the VA." "I know." "Then why do it again?" "Because the court wants its own expert." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd spent years learning how to live with nightmares. Years learning that asking for help wasn't weakness. Now those same medical records were being turned into weapons. I looked down at my hands. What if they think Daniel's right? Caroline leaned forward. Rebecca. She waited until I looked at her. Being treated for trauma doesn't make someone an unfit mother. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But after Afghanistan, I wasn't exactly the same woman I'd been before. Fireworks still made me flinch. I hated sitting with my back to restaurant doors. If someone dropped a heavy pallet in a warehouse, my pulse jumped before I could stop it. Daniel knew every one of those reactions. He'd watched me work through them. Now he was using them against me. 3 days later, I saw Emily for the first time. The visit took place inside a Panera Bread in Centerville, with a court-appointed supervisor sitting 3 tables away pretending to read a magazine. Emily barely touched her grilled cheese. She looked older than 13. Or maybe sadness just made children seem older. Hi, sweetheart. Hi. An awkward silence settled between us. I asked about school. She answered with one-word replies. Then she surprised me. Dad said you pointed a gun at him. The question sucked the air out of my lungs. No. She looked confused. He showed me a picture. I know. Then, why was the gun on the counter? I thought back. Then I remembered. My service pistol was locked in my travel case before I left for annual training. Emily frowned. I don't understand. Neither do I. She studied my face for several seconds. For the first time since I'd walked into Panera, she actually looked at me instead of through me. When our hour ended, she hugged me. It lasted barely 2 seconds, but it was enough to remind me she wasn't gone. Not yet. That afternoon, Caroline called. I spoke with the mortgage company, and they received a quitclaim deed transferring part of your ownership interest to Daniel. What? They believe you signed it. I never did. I know. She paused. The signature is convincing. I closed my eyes. How convincing? So convincing, she said quietly, that if you hadn't been attending Army training at Fort Knox the day it was signed, I'd be worried. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed staring at the beige carpet. Daniel hadn't suddenly decided to leave me. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, and I was only just beginning to see how carefully he'd built the trap. The first time Daniel and I walked through the front door of our house in Beaver Creek, we were carrying nothing but a tape measure and 2 folding lawn chairs. The hardwood floors were scratched. The kitchen wallpaper looked like it had survived the 70s. The backyard was mostly weeds. I loved it anyway. My dad had passed away the year before, and the small inheritance he left me became the down payment. Daniel and I both agreed the house would stay in my name because the money came from my family. At least that's what we agreed back then. Funny how people remember promises differently when millions of dollars enter the conversation. Caroline and I drove to the county recorder's office 2 days after my visit with Emily. The clerk printed copies of every document connected to the property. She slid the stack across the counter. There you go. I flipped through page after page until I found it. The quitclaim deed. My signature was there. Rebecca Ann Lawson. It even had my usual little curl on the final N. If I hadn't known better, I would have sworn I'd signed it myself. Caroline didn't say anything for nearly a minute. Finally, she looked up. This wasn't done by an amateur. You think Daniel forged it? I think someone did. She folded the papers carefully. And we're going to prove it. Back in her office, she started asking questions I hadn't considered. Who knew your signature? Daniel. Who handled your financial paperwork? Usually Daniel. Who had access to your old military records, tax returns, passport applications? I sighed. Daniel. Everything seemed to come back to him. That afternoon, Caroline called the real estate agent whose name appeared in the paperwork. The woman sounded nervous from the moment she answered. I didn't know there was a problem, she insisted. I was told Mrs. Lawson had already agreed to sell. Caroline put the call on speaker. Who told you that? My client, Mr. Lawson. The woman hesitated. He said his wife didn't like handling paperwork because of, well, she trailed off. Because of what? Caroline asked. He said combat had affected her memory. I closed my eyes. Daniel hadn't simply lied in court. He'd been repeating the same story to strangers for months. The agent apologized several times before forwarding every email Daniel had sent her. One attachment made my stomach turn. A power of attorney, supposedly signed by me, giving Daniel authority to sell the house. I pushed my chair back. That's fake. I know, Caroline said calmly, but fake documents leave real trails. For the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of hope. Later that evening, I stopped at the Kroger on North Fairfield Road to pick up groceries for the hotel. Halfway through the produce section, I heard someone call my name. Rebecca, it was my old neighbor Linda. We'd lived across the street from each other for nearly 10 years. She smiled politely, but there was something awkward behind her eyes. I've been meaning to tell you, she began carefully. What? She lowered her voice. I heard you've been struggling. I knew exactly where she'd heard it. I'm doing fine. She nodded too quickly. Well, Daniel said you've had a difficult time since the army. There it was. His story had already spread through the neighborhood. I could have argued, could have defended myself. Instead, I smiled. I'm getting a lawyer. Linda blinked. I think Daniel should consider getting one too. She looked surprised. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny, because she suddenly realized she might not know the whole story. The next afternoon, I had another supervised visit with Emily. We sat outside on a bench behind the Green Town Center while people walked by carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Emily picked at the sleeve of her sweatshirt. Grandma's been buying new curtains. I frowned. For your room. She shook her head. For yours. I stared at her. She says once the divorce is over, she's turning it into Dad's office. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Not exactly. Certainty. They weren't hoping to win. They believed they'd already won. As our visit ended, Caroline's name flashed across my phone. I answered immediately. Tell me you've got good news. I do. She sounded almost excited. The forensic video expert finished reviewing Daniel's kitchen video. And it wasn't one recording. I stopped walking. What do you mean? It was edited together from 3 separate videos. I felt the world pause around me. And the missing section, I asked. Caroline smiled. The missing section shows you asking Daniel to move away from the kitchen door, over and over again. The story he'd built was beginning to crack. He just didn't know it yet. If you'd asked anyone in our neighborhood who the better parent was, most of them probably would have said Daniel. He coached Emily's softball team for 2 seasons. He grilled burgers during block parties. He remembered birthdays. He smiled at cashiers. People love a man who looks dependable. They don't always notice what's happening behind the front door. 2 weeks after the first hearing, Daniel gave his deposition. Caroline and I sat across from him in a conference room at her office overlooking downtown Dayton. A court reporter typed every word while a ceiling fan hummed quietly overhead. Daniel wore another dark suit. This one was new. I wondered if he'd bought it with money from the home equity loan he'd opened using my forged signature. His attorney began with simple questions. Mr. Lawson, why did you file for divorce? Daniel lowered his eyes. I love my wife. Even Caroline almost rolled her eyes. I still do, he continued softly, but the woman I married isn't here anymore. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. Rebecca became forgetful. How so? She'd miss appointments. He didn't mention those appointments were usually after nights when I barely slept because of shoulder pain. She became paranoid. He neglected to explain that I'd caught someone trying to break into our garage the previous winter. She started making irrational decisions. The irrational decision he referred to, buying extra canned food and bottled water before a February ice storm that knocked out power across half the county. I wanted to interrupt. Instead, I sat perfectly still. Caroline had warned me. Let him finish building his own house of cards. Then came the restaurant story. Daniel told everyone about the evening I'd walked out of a Texas roadhouse after someone dropped a tray of dishes. What happened? His attorney asked. My wife dove under the table. A few seconds of silence filled the room. Daniel sighed dramatically. Emily started crying. He stopped there. He never mentioned that I apologized to everyone afterward. He never mentioned I immediately scheduled another appointment with Dr. Cho because I knew my reaction wasn't normal. Truth became much easier to manipulate when you removed half of it. The next witness was Darlene. She entered smiling. She even waved at me. I ignored her. She adjusted herself in the chair and folded her hands. I've always tried to love Rebecca like my own daughter. Caroline quietly wrote something on her legal pad. Later, she showed it to me. Interesting way to start a lie. I almost laughed. Darlene spent the next hour describing me as cold, unpredictable, and emotionally distant. She was never naturally maternal, she said. That one hurt. Not because it was true, because Emily might hear it someday. Then Darlene leaned toward the microphone. Some women come home from war. She paused. Others just bring the war home with them. Even Daniel looked uncomfortable. The line had been rehearsed. You could tell. Caroline finally stood. My turn. She walked slowly toward Darlene. Mrs. Lawson, you've mentioned several conversations between Rebecca and her therapist. Yes. How did you know what was discussed during private therapy sessions? Darlene blinked. Daniel told me. Caroline nodded. So your son had access to Rebecca's confidential medical information, I suppose. Did Rebecca give him permission? I assume she did. You assume. Another pause. Then Caroline smiled politely. No further questions. Back in the parking garage, I caught up with Caroline. Why'd you stop? Because she already answered the important question. I don't understand. Neither does she. Caroline unlocked her Buick. If Daniel accessed your medical records without authorization... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The next morning, I called the hospital's privacy office. By late afternoon, an investigator called back. We've reviewed the access logs. And there were multiple logins to your patient portal from a computer registered to Daniel's employer. I closed my eyes. So he really did it. We can't yet identify who was sitting at the keyboard, but someone was. Yes. After I hung up, I drove to my appointment with Dr. Marissa Feldman, the psychologist appointed by the court. Her office was quiet. No flags. No military posters. Just bookshelves, family photos, and a small bowl of peppermints. For nearly 3 hours, she asked about Afghanistan, about nightmares, about panic attacks, about Emily, about alcohol, about anger. I answered everything honestly. When she asked if I still struggled, I nodded. Sometimes. And how do you manage those moments? I asked for help. When the session ended, I walked outside feeling exhausted. I climbed into Caroline's car before I completely fell apart. What if honesty wasn't enough? I whispered. What if they only hear the word PTSD? Caroline let me cry for a minute. Then she handed me a tissue. You know what fraud looks like? I shook my head. It looks exactly like confidence. She started the engine. And Daniel has been very confident. That evening my phone rang. It was Dr. Alan Cho. His voice sounded tired. Rebecca, someone filed a complaint against me. For what? They're accusing me of falsifying your treatment records. I felt my stomach drop. Daniel wasn't just attacking me anymore. He was trying to destroy everyone willing to stand beside me. I always believed the hardest part of divorce would be watching my marriage fall apart. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching my daughter slowly disappear behind someone else's version of me. By the 3rd week, my supervised visits with Emily had become routine. Every Saturday afternoon, we met somewhere public, a Panera, a library meeting room, once even a park near Cox Arboretum. A court-appointed supervisor always sat close enough to hear us, but far enough away to pretend we had privacy. Emily had become careful. Too careful. She measured every sentence before speaking. Sometimes she'd start telling me about school, then suddenly stop, almost like she'd remembered she wasn't supposed to enjoy being with me. It broke my heart more than anything Daniel had done. One Thursday evening, Caroline called while I was folding laundry in the hotel room. I've been digging into Daniel's finances. I set a towel aside. Find anything? I found someone. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? There are recurring charges on one of his business credit cards. Same restaurants, same weekends, same hotel. I didn't answer. You already know, don't you? She asked gently. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I've known for months. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. A day later, Caroline emailed me several photographs she'd legally obtained through public social media. The woman was younger than me. Late 30s, maybe. Dark hair. Bright smile. Her name was Tessa Grant. She worked for the same medical supply company as Daniel. Most of the pictures were harmless enough. Dinner. A concert. A weekend in Nashville. Then I reached the 4th photo. She was standing in my kitchen, holding my favorite coffee mug. The chipped blue army mug Emily had given me on Veterans Day years earlier. I stared at that picture for a long time. Not because Daniel had another woman. I'd already accepted that possibility. What hurt was realizing he'd brought her into my home while I was away at annual training. Caroline broke the silence. Rebecca, I'm here. I know this is painful. No. I surprised myself. It's clarifying. For the first time, I understood why Daniel had been in such a hurry. The divorce. The forged documents. The custody fight. The settlement money. None of it had happened overnight. He'd been building a new life while dismantling mine. 2 days later, I met Emily again. This time we sat outside the Beaver Creek Public Library. She barely touched the hot chocolate I'd bought her. Finally, she looked around to make sure no one was listening. Mom, her voice was barely above a whisper. I only have a minute. Something in her expression made my heart race. What is it? Dad and Grandma keep talking about something called Operation Clean Sweep. I frowned. What is that? I don't know. She twisted the paper sleeve around her cup. But Grandma keeps saying they're almost done. I felt cold despite the afternoon sun. Emily leaned closer. They fight about it sometimes. What do they say? Mostly money, she swallowed. And deadlines. I didn't interrupt. She needed to tell this in her own way. Grandma made me practice answers. I froze. What answers? For the lady from court. The guardian ad litem. Emily nodded. She said if they ask whether you scare me. Her eyes filled with tears. I should say yes. I reached across the table but stopped before touching her. The supervisor was watching. I didn't want to lie, Emily whispered. I know. But Grandma said if I didn't help, she couldn't finish. I quietly handed her a napkin. After a long moment, she looked back at me. I found something. What? Dad has an old iPad in his desk. So, it records everything. I blinked. What do you mean? He forgot it was connected to his phone. My pulse quickened. There are voice recordings. I could barely breathe. Can you send them? She shook her head. Dad checks my phone. We sat there in silence. Cars rolled past on North Fairfield Road. Someone laughed near the library entrance. Life continued around us as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Then Emily looked me straight in the eyes. Mom? Yes? Grandma keeps saying once they get your money. She hesitated. Nobody can make them give it back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something that changed everything. Emily wasn't pulling away from me. She'd been trapped in the middle all along. And somehow, my 13-year-old daughter had just become the most important witness in the entire case. I didn't sleep much after Emily told me about the old iPad. Not because I expected some dramatic confession hidden inside it. Because I was terrified she'd get caught trying to help me. For the first time since this nightmare started, my biggest concern wasn't winning the case. It was protecting my daughter from the adults who were supposed to protect her. The next morning, Caroline met me at her office with a fresh cup of coffee waiting on the conference table. I've been thinking about Emily. So have I. We can't ask her to retrieve anything. I know. If Daniel's attorney finds out, they'll accuse you of involving her in the case. I'd never do that. Caroline nodded. I know you wouldn't. She picked up her phone. We're going through the guardian ad litem. Denise Porter, the court-appointed guardian ad litem, agreed to meet Emily privately at school later that week. She listened carefully while Emily explained the old iPad, then asked only one question. Would you feel safer if I took it with me? Emily nodded. Daniel never noticed it was gone. A few days later, Caroline called. Can you get here? Did they find something? Yes. Her voice sounded different. Controlled. Almost excited. I drove straight to her office. The iPad sat inside a clear evidence bag on the conference table. Beside it was a laptop belonging to a digital forensic specialist. We've copied everything without changing the original, he explained. He clicked one file. Static crackled through the speakers. Then Daniel's voice filled the room. We only have one chance to do this. Another voice answered. Darlene. I know. A drawer opened somewhere in the background. Papers rustled. Daniel sighed. If she gets temporary custody back, everything falls apart. Then Darlene laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to send chills down my spine. Relax. She paused. Once the judge thinks she's unstable, the money follows. I looked at Caroline. Neither of us spoke. The recording continued. We just need everyone telling the same story. Daniel sounded nervous. What about Emily? She'll say what she has to. There was another pause. Then Darlene said something that made Caroline slowly remove her glasses. 3.2 million should buy Tessa better taste than that ugly sectional. Even in the middle of everything, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because Darlene was criticizing furniture she'd never paid for while casually discussing stealing my life. Daniel groaned. Mom, what? Stay focused. The recording ended. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, I asked, can we use this? Caroline didn't answer immediately. It's complicated. Because Emily recorded it, she nodded. We're not going to gamble the entire case on one piece of evidence. She wanted something stronger. Something that couldn't be challenged. The forensic specialist opened another folder. This may help. Inside were automatically synchronized emails from Daniel's account. Most were ordinary. Work schedules, invoices, calendar reminders. Then one subject line caught my eye. Lake House budget. My heart skipped. The spreadsheet listed projected expenses. Down payment, furniture, boat slip, property taxes. At the bottom was a note. Use settlement funds after conservatorship is approved. I stared at the screen. He'd already planned how to spend my money. Another email appeared. This one was from Tessa. I told the doctor I'd wait until after the divorce to tell everyone. Below that, the baby's due in March. I leaned back in my chair. So she's pregnant? Caroline nodded. It appears so. For a strange moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt relieved. Now I understood why Daniel had rushed everything. He wasn't simply leaving me. He was trying to finance a brand new family. Unfortunately, the good news didn't last. 2 days later, Daniel's attorney filed an emergency motion accusing me of manipulating Emily into stealing private information. Judge Mercer denied his request to suspend my visitation. But she issued a warning to both sides. Emily is a child, she wrote. She is not an investigator. Reading those words hurt, because they were true. Emily never should have been carrying secrets this heavy. Then another phone call came. This one from Leonard Price, the forensic accountant Caroline had hired. I traced the money. What money? The home equity loan. I held my breath. $186,000 has already been moved. Where? Several accounts. He paused. And it's disappearing fast. I closed my eyes. Daniel hadn't been planning to steal from me. He already had. For the first month after Daniel filed for divorce, I woke up every morning thinking about one thing. Winning, not healing, not Emily. Winning. It scared me when I finally admitted it. I wanted him to hurt the way he'd hurt me. I wanted him to lose everything he'd tried to take from me. Every time I pictured his face in the courtroom, I imagined the look he'd have when Judge Mercer ruled against him. That wasn't who I'd been before all this, and it wasn't who I wanted Emily to see. One Friday evening I made a mistake. I had just left Caroline's office when I spotted Daniel's silver SUV turning into a restaurant parking lot near the green. Without thinking, I followed him. He parked outside Cooper's Hawk Winery. A few seconds later, Tessa climbed out of her car. Daniel kissed her before they even reached the front door. I gripped my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to march inside, to expose them in front of everyone, to throw every lie back in Daniel's face. Instead, I stayed where I was. Then I noticed someone sitting in the back seat of Daniel's SUV. Emily. She was wearing headphones, staring down at her phone, while her father disappeared into the restaurant with another woman. My anger vanished. All I could think was, she shouldn't have to watch this. I started my car and drove away. That night, I cried harder than I had since leaving my house. Not because Daniel had another relationship, because I realized revenge was beginning to control me the same way greed had controlled him. The following Tuesday, Caroline called. The psychological evaluation is finished. I drove to her office immediately. She handed me a thick report. Dr. Marissa Feldman's conclusion was only 3 paragraphs long. Rebecca Lawson demonstrates symptoms consistent with well-managed post-traumatic stress disorder. She shows no evidence of psychosis, impaired judgment, cognitive decline, or inability to safely parent her child. I read the page twice, then a third time. For weeks, I'd worried those appointments would somehow prove Daniel right. Instead, they proved exactly the opposite. Caroline smiled. This report is strong. But, she laughed. You know me too well. She tapped another folder. Daniel's attorney is already preparing to attack it. How? They'll say one evaluation doesn't erase years of problems. I sighed. I figured. But, she slid another document toward me. The hospital finished its investigation. I scanned the first page. According to the report, someone had repeatedly accessed my confidential patient portal, using login credentials assigned to an employee at Daniel's company. The employee denied ever viewing my records. The timestamps matched hours when Daniel had been working in that office. It isn't enough for criminal charges yet, Caroline explained, but it's enough to destroy his credibility. That afternoon, I met Leonard Price for the first time. He looked more like a retired high school principal than a forensic accountant. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a Cincinnati Reds coffee mug sitting beside his calculator. He spread several bank statements across the table. I found your money. I leaned forward. The $186,000, he nodded. It didn't disappear. He traced the transfers with a pencil. It moved through 3 different accounts. Then he circled one transaction. $42,000. I looked at the payee, Darlene Lawson. The description read, caregiving services. I couldn't help laughing. Caring for who? Apparently, Leonard said dryly, you. We both laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. Then his smile faded. The remaining money was used as a deposit on a lake house near Indian Lake. So it was true. Daniel had already started buying the future he'd planned with Tessa. A future financed by my injuries. As if that weren't enough, another blow arrived 2 days later. My Army Reserve commander called. Rebecca. His voice sounded uncomfortable. Until the court resolves these allegations, we're temporarily removing you from your leadership assignment. I knew it wasn't punishment, just policy. Still, after 23 years in uniform, hearing those words hurt more than I expected. That evening, I sat alone in my hotel room staring at the settlement offer Daniel's attorney had emailed. Joint custody. Sell the house. Daniel keeps $900,000. For one long moment, I almost signed it. Then Caroline looked at me across her desk and quietly asked, could you live with Emily believing every one of those lies was true? I picked up the pen. Then I laid it back down. No. 3 days later, Leonard called again. I found something else. What is it? The company that prepared the forged power of attorney. I waited. The owner is Darlene's nephew. He paused. And he has a previous conviction for falsifying loan applications. For the first time since Daniel filed for divorce, I felt the ground beginning to shift beneath his feet. If you'd told me a month earlier that my mother-in-law would accidentally damage her own case because of a group text, I would have laughed. Darlene wasn't careless. She planned everything. Every cruel comment came wrapped in a smile. Every insult sounded like friendly advice. She was the kind of woman who could ruin your reputation at a church potluck while handing you a slice of homemade apple pie, which made what happened next almost unbelievable. It started on a Tuesday morning. Caroline called before I'd even finished breakfast. Are you sitting down? I am now. I think Darlene just made the biggest mistake of this entire case. I waited. What happened? She sent a text to the wrong people. I blinked. What kind of text? The kind that should never exist. An hour later, I was sitting across from Caroline as she handed me printed screenshots. Darlene had meant to send a message to Daniel. Instead, she accidentally sent it to a church group called Tuesday Prayer Circle. The message read, "Remember, Rebecca threatened us in June, not July. We all need the same story." I stared at the page. Then I looked back at Caroline. "That's real." "Oh, it's real." What happened after she realized it? She tried to delete it, but several people had already seen it. One of those people happened to be Martha Collins, a retired court reporter, someone who had spent 35 years listening to witnesses testify under oath. The moment Martha read Darlene's message, she took screenshots before the text disappeared. Then she called Caroline. "I've never met Martha," I admitted. "You don't have to." Caroline smiled. "She believes in telling the truth." For the first time in weeks, it felt like someone outside my own circle had stepped forward simply because something wasn't right. A few days later, Darlene was questioned about the message. She smiled exactly the way she always did. "Oh, goodness." She even laughed. "That wasn't about Rebecca." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "No." "No. What was it about?" "Our community theater." I nearly choked on my coffee. Caroline didn't even blink. "Community theater?" "Yes. We were practicing lines." Caroline opened another folder. "Mrs. Lawson, isn't it true your church hasn't had a theater program since before COVID?" The smile disappeared. Just for a second. Then Darlene recovered. "I may have confused the dates." Caroline thanked her. Nothing more. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She simply let the answer sit there. Later, she explained why. People who lie usually keep talking. And we don't interrupt them. Meanwhile, another surprise arrived. Tessa asked to meet. Not with me. With Caroline. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear anything she had to say, but Caroline convinced me. "You don't have to forgive her." "I'm not planning to." "But you should hear her." The meeting took place in Caroline's office. Tessa looked exhausted. She kept twisting a paper cup between her hands. "I didn't know." Her voice shook. "I swear I didn't." She explained that Daniel had told her we were already separated, that the divorce had been delayed only because of paperwork. Then she found newspaper records showing the custody hearing. Everything after that unraveled. He asked me to lie. "About what?" Caroline asked. "When our relationship started." She looked down. "And about the baby." The room went quiet. I refused. For the first time, I saw someone else who had also been manipulated by Daniel. It didn't erase the affair, but it changed how I saw her. That afternoon, Daniel's original attorney filed paperwork asking to withdraw from the case. The judge approved the request. Apparently, even his own lawyer no longer trusted what Daniel was saying. Emily came to stay with me that weekend. For the first time in months, no supervisor sat nearby. No one watched the clock. We ordered frozen pizza, spread an old blanket across the living room floor of my house, and watched Jeopardy together. Halfway through dinner, Emily quietly asked, "Mom?" "Yeah." "Are you mad at me?" I reached across the pizza box and took her hand. "No, sweetheart." I smiled through tears. "I'm angry that grown-ups expected a 13-year-old girl to carry secrets that never should have been hers." For the first time since all of this began, Emily smiled back. The final hearing began on a gray Thursday morning in early November. Downtown Dayton was still waking up when Caroline and I walked into the Montgomery County Courthouse just after 8. People hurried past carrying coffee cups and umbrellas. Lawyers stood in little circles reviewing notes one last time. I had barely slept, not because I was afraid of losing, because I knew that by the end of the day one version of the truth would survive. I prayed it would be mine. Emily wasn't in the courtroom. Judge Mercer had decided it was best that she stay at school. I was grateful. She'd already carried more than any 13-year-old should. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later. His confidence was gone. He'd hired a new attorney, Mark Ellison, after his first lawyer withdrew from the case. Ellison had a reputation for being aggressive, but even he looked uncomfortable sitting beside Daniel. Darlene still wore her pearls. She still smiled at people in the hallway. She still acted like she belonged there. Court began promptly at 9. Judge Mercer looked around the room. "Counselors, let's finish this." Daniel testified first. He repeated the same story he'd been telling for months. "Rebecca changed after Afghanistan." He glanced toward me. "She became distant." He paused. "Unpredictable." Then he looked directly at the judge. "I don't doubt she loves our daughter." He sighed. "But love isn't always enough." Ellison nodded approvingly. Daniel continued, "I worry about Emily every single day. If I hadn't known him, I might have believed him." That was Daniel's greatest talent. He didn't sound like a liar. He sounded like a worried husband. Then came Darlene. She walked confidently to the witness stand. "I've only ever wanted what's best for my granddaughter." Caroline waited until Darlene finished. Then she stood. "Mrs. Lawson." "Yes." "Do you recognize this exhibit?" She handed Darlene a printed screenshot. The color drained from Darlene's face almost immediately. "The text message you accidentally sent to the Tuesday prayer circle." Darlene cleared her throat. "I already explained that." "You said it referred to community theater." "That's correct." Caroline nodded. "Then perhaps you can explain this." A second screenshot appeared on the courtroom monitor. This one had never been shown before. Another message from Darlene. "Once Daniel controls the settlement, Rebecca can spend the rest of her life saluting a mailbox." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge Mercer adjusted her glasses. Caroline remained calm. "Is that your message?" Darlene hesitated. "Yes." "And what exactly did you mean by controls the settlement?" She looked toward Daniel. For the first time since I'd known her, Darlene had no clever answer. Next came Leonard Price. The forensic accountant explained every transfer of the missing $186,000. He showed exactly where the money had gone. The forged home equity loan, the transfer to Darlene, the payment for the lake house, the spreadsheets, the account numbers. Every dollar had a trail. Then the digital forensics expert testified. He explained how Daniel's kitchen video had been edited from 3 separate recordings. He showed the missing footage. There I was, standing in my own kitchen, asking Daniel to move away from the doorway. Again and again. The photograph of my handgun. It had been taken hours later. Not during the argument. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Dr. Marissa Feldman testified next. She spoke plainly. Major Lawson experiences symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress. Daniel's attorney smiled. Then Dr. Feldman continued. Those symptoms do not impair her judgment, decision-making, parenting ability, or ability to safely manage her financial affairs. The smile disappeared. Finally, Caroline stood one last time. Your Honor. She carried a thick military service record to the bench. This is Rebecca Lawson's complete personnel file. Judge Mercer accepted it. She spent several minutes reading. No one spoke. You could hear pages turning. She stopped once. Read the same paragraph again. Then continued. The courtroom felt impossibly still. Finally, she closed the file, looked directly at Daniel, then at Darlene. Her voice was quiet, but every person in that room heard every word. Do either of you actually know who your wife really is? No one answered. Judge Mercer looked back down at the file. This record doesn't describe a woman who broke under pressure. She paused. It describes someone who repeatedly ran toward danger to save other people. Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked afraid. And Darlene, the woman who once told me my medals wouldn't help me, couldn't even look in my direction anymore. You spend enough time in court and you start to realize something. Real victories don't usually come with dramatic music or people cheering. Most of the time they arrive in complete silence. Judge Mercer rested both hands on the military file for a moment before she looked back at everyone in the courtroom. Then she began speaking. Over the last several months, she said, this court has heard repeated claims that Mrs. Lawson is mentally incapable of caring for her daughter or managing her finances. She glanced toward Daniel. Those claims are not supported by the evidence. No one moved. The judge continued. The independent psychological evaluation finds Mrs. Lawson mentally competent. She turned another page. The digital forensic evidence establishes that the kitchen video presented by Mr. Lawson was intentionally edited. Daniel stared down at the defense table. The firearm photograph was taken separately and presented in a misleading context. His attorney quietly closed his notebook. Judge Mercer wasn't finished. The forged property documents, unauthorized financial transactions, and testimony presented by the forensic accountant demonstrate a deliberate effort to obtain control of Mrs. Lawson's separate property. She looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Lawson, this court is particularly troubled by your repeated attempts to portray your wife's military service as proof of parental unfitness. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Judge Mercer held up Rebecca Lawson's service record. This file tells a very different story. She set it back down. It documents years of honorable service, repeated leadership evaluations, and extraordinary courage under circumstances most people cannot imagine. Then she looked toward me. Major Lawson sought treatment when she needed it. Another pause. She followed medical advice. Another page turned. And she continued to meet the standards required to serve. She faced Daniel again. That is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of responsibility. I didn't realize tears were running down my face until Caroline quietly handed me a tissue. Judge Mercer continued reading her ruling. The court awards primary residential custody of Emily Lawson to Mrs. Lawson. I closed my eyes. My shoulders dropped for the first time in months. Mr. Lawson shall receive supervised parenting time until completion of parenting classes and a psychological evaluation. Daniel's face went pale. The marital residence remains the sole property of Mrs. Lawson. I looked at Caroline. She gave the smallest nod. The $3.2 million settlement remains Mrs. Lawson's separate property. Darlene suddenly stood. That's ridiculous. Judge Mercer looked over her glasses. Mrs. Lawson, sit down. This isn't fair. Bailiff. The bailiff took one step toward her. Darlene sat back down. Her face was bright red. Judge Mercer continued as though nothing had happened. The court further orders restitution proceedings regarding the improperly transferred home equity funds. She looked toward Daniel one final time. Evidence of document forgery, unauthorized access to confidential medical records, and possible financial fraud shall be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for review. Daniel whispered something to his attorney. The attorney slowly shook his head. There wasn't anything left to argue. As everyone stood to leave, Darlene muttered loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. I was only trying to protect my family. Judge Mercer stopped gathering her papers. Without raising her voice, she answered, Concerned grandmothers don't submit false evidence or coach children to lie. The words landed harder than any shouted argument. For the first time since I'd known her, Darlene had absolutely nothing to say. Outside the courtroom, reporters weren't waiting. There were no television cameras. Just families heading to other hearings, lawyers checking their phones, and a vending machine humming in the hallway. Real life. Daniel caught up with me before I reached the elevators. Rebecca. I turned. He looked older than he had that morning. Tessa left. I simply looked at him. The lake house is gone. Still, I said nothing. I made mistakes. I nodded once. You did. He swallowed. Can we fix any of this? I thought about 17 years of marriage. About Emily crying in a supervised visitation room. About forged signatures. Lies. Humiliation. Then I answered as calmly as I could. You didn't lose me today, Daniel. He frowned. You lost me the day you decided my injuries were something you could profit from. The elevator doors opened. Emily slipped her hand into mine. Together. We walked away. People sometimes ask me what happened after the judge ruled in my favor. They usually expect a dramatic ending. The truth is, real life doesn't work that way. Winning in court didn't erase what happened. It simply gave me the chance to start rebuilding. 6 months later, spring finally returned to Ohio. The maple tree in my front yard had started growing leaves again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I found myself opening the windows instead of hiding behind closed curtains. The house sounded different. Peace has its own kind of silence. Emily was slowly finding her way back too. She started counseling a few weeks after the trial ended. Some days she'd come home laughing about school. Other days she'd sit quietly on the back porch thinking about everything that had happened. I never pushed her to talk. I'd learned that healing doesn't follow a schedule. One Saturday morning she surprised me. Mom, yeah. Can we plant tomatoes again this year? I smiled. My dad and I used to grow tomatoes every summer. After he passed away, I kept the tradition alive until life became too busy. I'd like that. So we spent the afternoon turning over the soil in the raised garden beds behind the house. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't dramatic. But after months spent inside courtrooms and lawyers' offices, ordinary life felt like the greatest gift in the world. Daniel's life looked very different. The criminal investigation didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he eventually accepted a plea agreement involving fraud-related charges. He was ordered to pay restitution placed on probation and lost the management position he'd held for nearly 12 years. I didn't celebrate. There wasn't much to celebrate. Watching someone face the consequences of their own choices isn't the same thing as enjoying their suffering. As for Darlene, she sold her condominium to help repay part of the money she'd received. She moved in with her cousin outside Indianapolis. Every now and then I'd hear from mutual friends that she still insisted she'd been misunderstood. I stopped worrying about what she said. People who truly knew me no longer believed her. One afternoon I received another phone call. It was my Army Reserve commander. I've got good news. I smiled before he even continued. Your administrative review is complete. And everything has been cleared. A few months later I returned long enough to finish my service with the dignity I'd hoped for all along. Then I retired on my own terms. Not because someone pushed me out, because it was finally time. The settlement money remained largely untouched. Instead of buying something extravagant, I used a small portion to support a nonprofit in Dayton that helps veterans facing financial abuse and legal exploitation. I never put my name on the building. I didn't need to. Helping someone else felt better than proving anything to Daniel. One rainy Saturday morning, Emily found the wooden box where I kept my medals. She lifted one carefully. Why don't you display these? I looked at the ribbons for a long moment. For years I'd thought they represented everything I'd survived. Now they meant something different. They remind me of people I served with, I said softly. She smiled. But I don't need them hanging on a wall. I already know what they mean. She closed the box and hugged me. That hug lasted a little longer than the ones we'd shared during those painful weeks of supervised visits. Long enough for both of us to know we were going to be okay. Looking back, I don't think revenge was the most important part of my story. The real victory was refusing to let someone else's lies define who I was. Pain changed me. I won't pretend it didn't. But being changed isn't the same as being broken. Sometimes it simply means you've learned exactly what you'll never allow again. If you've ever had someone use your hardest season against you, I hope you remember this. Their version of you doesn't have to become your future. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take care of yourself and of the people who truly earn your trust. The end.